This is Dr. Laura Tate with the second of a three-part video series on using Canada Census data for small areas. The first video explained what the census is and why it's helpful, especially for those of us interested in urban planning issues. In this series, we're going to look in a bit more detail at how to get and work with census data for small areas. And this involves a couple of steps. First of all, looking at how the census considers different geographies or different measurement units across space, and then where on the website you find all of this to download it and then start to use. The first thing you'll need to do when downloading small area data from the census is be clear with yourself and with the others that you're working with and that you're trying to support what areas you're talking about. Now, this sounds really straightforward, but sometimes it can require a few conversations or at least getting something from an official source. Just as an example, if you're planning for schools, everybody needs to be clear on what the catchment area is for the school. With a neighborhood plan, if you're trying to do a plan for a neighborhood or update a plan, you need to be clear on what those neighborhood boundaries are. If you just ask the person in the street, they might give you one set of ideas based on how they use their neighborhood, but the official boundaries might be quite different. So that's the first thing you need to do. The second thing, though, is you need to match that up with the boundaries that the census has defined, and this is where things can get a little bit tricky. In theory, the census data would line up perfectly with your neighborhood boundaries, the census boundaries, that is. In theory, the census would define a small area close to your neighborhood using exactly the same boundaries that you have, but in practice, that doesn't happen as often as we would like. And there's a good reason for it. The census tries to keep some areas that are the same. So it tries to keep some community-based areas the same over time so that you can make comparisons. And as neighborhoods grow and change, sometimes what feels like your neighborhood can shift. So the point is that there are some rigid boundaries that are used by Statistics Canada called census tracts that might come close to your neighborhood boundary. But they may not be exact. And there are a couple of options for handling that, but one of them, which we'll talk about today, is just living with it, but being clear about where they do and don't align. So as you'll see from this diagram, which Statistics Canada has created, there are many different smaller levels of geography that the census can present to us. So obviously there is Canada-wide information that gets presented, and there are also statistics that are presented at a provincial level. You'll see I've circled in orange here, province or territory. Now from there is where it gets a little tricky, and it sort of depends on what data is getting produced. If you'll look at the far left side of the slide, you'll see something called a forward sortation area, which is really a part of a postal code. That can be used, and those do shift a little bit over time, but basically the statistics that you get by forward sortation area tend to come later in the census release. And also you can get some other data from Stats Canada that is presented by forward sortation area. So while this is really great for creating smaller geographies, it's not accessible right away. And so really the kind of geography that is accessible right away, after the province, the next level down on the right-hand side, you'll see census metropolitan area, which is basically a big metropolitan area like Vancouver, Victoria, Nanaimo, Kelowna, and so forth, and of course Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa. And from there, from the census metropolitan area, there is also something called a census subdivision, which really just means a municipality. So it's almost like there's another language that gets spoken when you're talking about census data. So whenever someone from Stats Canada is talking about a CSD or census subdivision, just think of that as a city or municipality. Below that then is the census tract. And that is, again, something that remains relatively consistent. Typically, the populations involved in a census tract are anywhere from 2,500 to 8,000. Now, what happens if your city grows a lot and you had a census tract that had 7,000 people, and then the next census, it's got 10,000 people. What Stats Canada typically does in those instances is they divide it in two. So it's really easy if you want to go back in time to at least look at kind of the two, you put the two halves together in the new census to compare to the old census. And even the way they number it tends to help show you how there was a relationship. But typically, if things are growing a lot slower, that census tract is going to stay the same. The next level below it, though, is called a dissemination area. These used to be called enumeration areas, but I guess they changed the terms. And those really do change a lot. So that's technically smaller than a census tract, but you can't compare it as easily over time. So you have to make some judgment calls when you're doing these small area data runs or data downloads as to whether or not you want to be able to compare over time, or you just don't care, you just want the present day. I would suggest that census tract is a really good place to start for most things, and then only go to the smaller level of the dissemination area if you have a really good reason. So that's just an overview of how all these different geographies work together. But I think it's important now to just look at how we tend to line these things up. So let's look at a case study from Victoria. So I wanted to help a class do a project in a suburb of Victoria called Saanich. And so what I wanted to do was take a look at this particular neighborhood in Saanich that we were working on, known as the Mackenzie Quadra Corridor. Just as an aside, I wanted to call your attention to some of these census tracts that share the first 3 digits, but they have a different decimal point. So you have a census tract 121.01, 121.03, and 121.04. And presumably there's a 121.02, but it's not in this diagram. What this means is that initially all those census tracts sharing that 120121 prefix, if you will, they were once a single census tract, and they got divided up. So that the first 3 digits that are the same shows you that those, if you're trying to make comparisons over time, you need to compare all 3 of them to an older census tract known as 0.0121. I know that's really geeky, but I just want to make sure that you understand how all these things fit together. And the first job, of course, is to look at which census tracts come closest to lining up with this. And you can see from this, the other thing is, so you can download the map from the Stats Canada website, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a moment. But what you want to do once you've downloaded the map is then, again, you probably, if you're looking at a larger city, you're going to have to kind of get a more zoomed in view. And that typically means looking at an inset map, which I'm showing you here. So as you'll see in this next slide, I've just done a really rough outline of what the corridor looks like. And what you can see is that there are several different census tracts that surround it. But if I'm really only interested in a few blocks north and south of this corridor, then I'm going to get way too much data, way too big an area for my purposes. Like really, this area that I've highlighted in light blue shows you what my ideal would be. And then here, this map where I've highlighted the census tracts in yellow shows you just how much bigger than my neighborhood the census tracts are. So as I noted before, in this case, we have some choices to make. We either just live with it and acknowledge it and we become honest about this, or we have to go down to that dissemination area level of data if it's available and if we don't care about making comparisons over time. So for the purposes of my class project, I actually don't mind going with this larger neighborhood because I'm not going to use it for things like population and dwelling counts. I'm mainly interested in age breakdowns and commuting patterns. And so I'm going to make a big assumption that these will kind of, within a census tract, it'll be the same as the smaller block area. So as long as I note this and give what I call appropriate caveats, or tell people, hey, this isn't exactly what you want, but it's close, and here's how it's different, As long as you do that, I think it's an okay thing to do, especially for a class project. If you're working for a municipality or a regional district, you can also, as the census, more and more of the census data gets released, you can also get customized runs that will give you the smaller areas that you're looking for if that's really important to you. So this is how you figure out which data to download. Now I'm going to show you where on the website for Statistics Canada that you go to download these maps, because unless you're doing the exact case study I've done, you're going to need to figure this out for yourself. So let's take a closer look then at the parts of the website that you need. When you're trying to download these census tract reference maps for yourself, I would recommend that you simply do a search on part of the term I've circled here. So 2021 census tract maps or reference maps. And I think if you do that, it'll be much quicker and easier for you. I will also make a link available if you're taking a course with me through the online learning platform. But whether or not you take a course with me, here's the search terms that you would use to come up with this screen. So when you see this screen, you will have a choice of either downloading census tract maps for a census agglomeration or a census metropolitan area. And as you'll recall, a census metropolitan area is for a larger urban region. Census agglomeration, they're just a kind of funny other term. I have to admit I'm not very familiar with it. There's only one of these in all of BC, and that's Prince George. So unless you're looking something up for Prince George, you're going to want most likely a census metropolitan area. And then once you do that, you will get a chance to specify which census metropolitan interests you. There will be a drop-down list and you can choose it. So once I choose Victoria, which is where Saanich is located, it's within the larger census metropolitan area of Victoria, I can first of all look at the broader map, but then once I do that, I will find that probably I need some more details. So I will start going through the inset maps just to see which ones I need. And then I will come up with something that shows in more detail the area that I'm looking for. And you'll probably still need to zoom in a little bit. But what I often do is I print a copy, or at least I have a copy of that available on my screen when I start to download the data. That's really what you need to know in terms of figuring out which areas you need to look at and how to align the census boundaries with your neighborhood boundaries, and getting yourself prepared to download just the data for the census tracts that you need. That is all that we're covering in this video. I would encourage you to look to the next video to learn about where to download this data. And thanks again for tuning in to this, and I look forward to seeing you in the third video in this series.